Welcome back, everyone. I'm Jennifer Kaminsky at the Climate Registry, and I'm happy to close out the day with you. But first, I'd like to thank a few more of our sponsors without whom this wouldn't be possible. Thank you to Platinum sponsor Dominion Energy and Gold sponsors Intel and Southern California Gas Company. And thank you to our Silver sponsors, the Nature Conservancy, WSP, Edison International, Train Technologies, DTE, Volvo Group, and PSEG. Our next discussion focuses on the road to zero and the future of transport. We know that decarbonizing the transportation sector is going to take collaboration among policymakers and local jurisdictions, utilities, vehicle manufacturers, and innovators. We're happy to have several of these perspectives represented in our next session. With that, I'll turn it over to James Bradbury, Mitigation Program Director at Georgetown Climate Center, to kick it off. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. I'm James Bradbury from the Georgetown Climate Center. Thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to this plenary session, The Road to Zero Emissions and the Future of Transport. So as I'm sure you all know, the transportation sector now accounts for 36% of total U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions, according to the Energy Information Administration. And 24% of transportation emissions come from the combustion of diesel fuel, which is mostly used by heavy and medium-duty trucks and buses. And this will be a major focus for our conversation in this session today. Importantly, diesel emissions contribute disproportionately to negative health outcomes caused by transportation emissions, including childhood asthma, premature deaths associated with exposure to particulate matter in particular. As a result, we know that prioritizing emission reductions from these vehicles would have equity benefits, since environmental justice communities are disproportionately exposed to harmful diesel emissions from trucks and buses operating in or near their communities. So for these reasons, many policymakers are developing ambitious new regulatory programs and incentives to drive emission reductions, and in particular from heavy-duty, medium-duty vehicles. And these also happen to be among the most cost-effective vehicles to electrify. For example, the total cost of ownership for electric buses is increasingly competitive with or lower than the cost of ownership for diesel buses when you account for, of course, the cost of operations and maintenance. Of course, there are also some significant challenges to truck and bus electrification, which we'll get into a bit on this panel. As Jennifer alluded to in her intro, there are many parties also who need to be engaged: the public sector, private sector, and communities. One of the recurring themes of this session, in fact, will be that low carbon transportation in general, and electrification in particular, requires engagement with a wide range of stakeholders and different government agencies, some of whom have not always been so directly involved with transportation issues historically. This includes, of course, electric utilities and utility commissions, and also many policymakers are more actively engaging with environmental justice communities and prioritizing their needs when considering how and where to focus policy efforts and investments in clean transportation. So this session will include different perspectives on strategies for electrification, in particular for heavy and medium duty vehicles. We're going to have a particular focus on fleet vehicles because fleets are emerging as really the first use cases from which we can learn and build as we look to expand markets for electric vehicles. So with this in mind, we'll start our journey on the road to zero emissions by taking a big step in the right direction with this great panel. So the speakers we have lined up for you, we'll start with Keith Kerman, the Chief Fleet Officer of the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services. And then we'll hear after that from Jill Anderson and Don Fenton. I will briefly introduce them after Keith goes. But we'll start with Keith. And he of course, runs the largest municipal fleet in the country. So I think he'll start us off with some enlightening input. Keith?
Okay. Thank you very much, James. And thank you for having me here today on behalf of Mayor de Blasio and our Commissioner Lisette Camillo. We're happy to talk about what we're trying to do in New York City on the fleet side. New York City operates the largest municipal fleet in the United States with 30,000 vehicles. We also support the 10,000 plus school buses that are actually contracted, but we're doing some interesting stuff there on electrification. We are some of the most well-known fleet operations in the world: the police department, the sanitation department, the New York City Fire Department. I often joke you cannot turn on a TV set in the United States on any given night and not see our vehicles in operation. We are also one of the greenest fleets operating. We have currently about 20,000 vehicles operating on some type of alternative fuel, whether it's electric, hybrid, biofuels, even solar, and we want to push that even more. Under Mayor de Blasio, we've committed to going to an all-electric fleet. And we operate 160 types of vehicles. We operate something of everything, and we do so in some of the toughest and most important environments you can imagine, in emergency services, 24/7, plowing streets, securing streets, responding to emergencies, medical emergencies, as well as fire emergencies, and everything in between. So currently, we operate the largest electric fleet in New York State with 3,100 plus vehicles, the largest electric charging network with 1,070 ports and growing. Just last week, Mayor de Blasio announced a new $75 million investment, more fast charging, more. We're going to do our first repowering. We're going to look at retrofitting some of our older diesel trucks and making them electric, as well as looking into expanding our biofuels program. Really quickly, we have a 3-part program for sustainability: electrify everything you can as soon as you can, implement hybrids and more efficient technologies where you can't do that quite yet. The New York City Police Department is going to an all hybrid fleet as we take our first steps to electric, which we're doing at the same time. And then implementing biofuels. We've been one of the big users of biodiesel and renewable diesel on the East Coast. And until we can get to electrification for all our trucks and our 5,000 off-road equipment pieces, we want to go to more efficient units in biofuels. So we're pushing every front we can. We certainly need the rest of the marketplace and all of you to get there, right? One fleet cannot move the market. We need everybody pushing in this direction, and that's why we're happy to be here.
Appreciate that. And we will next hear from Jill Anderson, Senior Vice President, Customer Service, Southern California Edison, who can share her perspective from a major investor-owned utility that operates in a climate leadership state. Jill?
Thank you. Thanks, James. And thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. So at Southern California Edison, we have articulated what we call the clean energy and electrification pathway, which is the way that we think we can achieve the greenhouse gas reduction goals for California, supported by, what we are seeing as a movement nationwide. And they're big numbers. We think that we need 2/3 of all of the medium duty vehicles to be electric, 1/3 of all the heavy duty vehicles. And if you look at light duty passenger cars, we're seeing that you're going to need 3/4 of all of the cars in California to be electrified if we're going to reach our carbon neutrality goals. And that's a big, big leap from where we are today. And so at SCE, we're really focused on accelerating the adoption of EVs, starting with awareness and making sure they're available and making sure they're affordable. And the utility itself, utilities like us, we are in a really unique position to be able to make sure that we're deploying the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, that is giving customers the confidence that they need in order to make that step forward, like Keith is describing, all those commitments that someone who is actually operating a fleet doing. They need to know and feel like the electric fuel that's going to be required is going to be available and affordable for them. So that's the role that we see that we play as the utility, and we are really excited to be managing some of the largest electric vehicle infrastructure programs in the country. So looking forward to talking more about that.
Thank you so much, Jill. And I've got a bunch of questions for you and the rest of the group, and we'll get to those in a minute. But next and last, but certainly not least, we'll hear from Don Fenton, the Vice President, government relations and public affairs at Volvo Group North America, who can share the perspective of a leading electric vehicle manufacturer. Dawn?
Great. Thanks so much, James. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you today. As you mentioned, I'm with Volvo Group, which I'm sure many in the audience know as the Swedish company. We're headquartered in Gothenburg, Sweden, and we're in 190 countries across the globe. But here in North America, we have our headquarters in North Carolina. And we employ about 13,000 people, and we have most of our manufacturing and remanufacturing locations on the East Coast. We're very much an East Coast-based company. Last year, we made a commitment as a company to have all of our products be 100% fossil fuel free by 2040. All of our sales to be that way. And as an interim goal towards that, we're committed to have 35% of our products sold be zero emission by 2030. So we are all in on this. We've made major investments and major commitments to move towards a zero emission vehicle future. We've been selling all electric vehicles in Europe for some time. But also here in the United States, we have several zero-emission vehicles across our product line. We have a Volvo truck, Class 8 truck that's currently running. Volvo also owns the Mack brand. And so we have a Mack electric refuse truck. Our Volvo construction equipment company has some all-electric excavators and wheel loaders for urban applications that are electric. And of course, we have an all-electric bus. So, but we're probably the project if anybody's heard about what Volvo is doing in electric vehicles, you've probably heard about the Volvo Lights project. And this is a $90 million project that was funded in part by the California Air Resources Board under their climate investments program, which is really looking to bring a whole ecosystem of electric vehicles into Southern California. The project began last year, is continuing, not last year, I'm sorry, it began in 2019. It's going to continue through the first quarter of next year. And it's made up of 13 additional partners working with us to put this whole ecosystem in place. With electric trucks, it's not just like upgrading to the next model year of the new and improved truck, but now we have to think about not just the truck, but the infrastructure that goes with it, having and what that entails. It's working with the infrastructure equipment providers, with utilities like Southern California Edison, who is one of the partners in that program. We're working with local community colleges on workforce training. There's really a whole set of stakeholders involved. So we've been very excited about that program. We've learned a lot from that. There have been several trucks that we've put in operations with several different fleets. We actually have trucks in that project that have been going to different fleets so they can test them out under a lease arrangement for a couple of months' time. To really expose others to what it would mean to put some of these trucks into your fleets. And so not only are we learning a lot from this, but we're working to try and share some of our lessons learned out of that project. And I'm happy to talk more about that as part of the conversation as we go forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Dawn. And actually, I think since you were just touching on lights, I'm sure the audience would like to learn more about that. That was one of the things I wanted to ask you about. So maybe if you could say a little bit about those lessons learned. What have you learned? What have been successes? What have been challenges? A little bit more on the Lights program, if you would.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the Lights program we see has been a huge success in many ways, but certainly not without its challenges. But that doesn't mean that those challenges don't add to the success of the project, because the point of the project is really to help understand what is necessary in this transition going forward. I have to say, in terms of some of the lessons learned, probably one of the biggest things that we've learned is that it really is moving towards electric vehicles. There's not a one size fits all kind of model. There are so many different types of fleets, so many different fleets that have different duty cycles for their vehicles. They operate their fleets very differently. Certainly every fleet has, is in a different location, and the ability of the grid to take additional charging, to be available for the charging, the status of the grid might be different in different locations. And so, an individual assessment needs to be made depending on where that customer, that fleet is located. And so there really is there's no one correct way forward, or there's no one correct way that, or easy way that a fleet can integrate these electric vehicles into their operations. I think another lesson learned is that things take longer than you would normally expect. This is a whole new paradigm shift, and so there's things to consider in terms of, say, for example, the infrastructure we've learned takes a lot longer to put into place than we might have thought, and certainly longer than it takes, say, for Volvo to actually deliver the truck. The time of from placement of order to delivery of the truck is much shorter than the case with the infrastructure, and some of that, it's due to a variety of reasons. It's no fault of the utilities or no fault of anybody, but it's just a matter of that this is new. There's also issues in terms of permitting issues. Sometimes there's in California where this project was, I mean, we had issues around wildfires and concerns about the grid, and obviously the utilities have more stakeholders and that they have to be responsible to than the in the fleets and building out the infrastructure. So there's there's a lot to consider here. I think one of the last things I'll say is that it really again, it's another example of how every situation is different. And just one example is, for example, a fleet might want to put in charging infrastructure. But what if they don't own their warehouse? What if they're leasing rather than owning? Then that could potentially add complications around getting permission to make the investments in the grid. Or in the case of the Lights project, we had some of our fleets putting in solar panels on their warehouse roofs. But then if they didn't own the buildings, that added further delays or complications in terms of trying to get that done. So again, I think the biggest point is just that it's really a case-by-case basis. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't go forward, but you should just plan accordingly and have some patience as you move ahead.
Thank you, Dawn. All really helpful insights, and great to learn more about the Lights project. I think on that grid topic, we'll get to you in a sec, Keith, but I wanted to ask Jill to say a little more. You mentioned, Jill, that the electrification goals for California and really across the country are very ambitious. And what are you finding to be kind of the key infrastructure issues? And then also, how is this, what are the specific issues with respect to medium duty, heavy duty vehicles in particular?
Yeah, I'd love to build on what Dawn just said, because it's such an important point that right now, each of these development projects can feel very unique and then have their own unique set of circumstances, and it can go slower maybe than what the customer, what the utility wants to achieve. And so one thing that we're learning is that early communication and coordination between the utility, the customer, and all the other stakeholders. Dawn mentioned permits and everything else, right? That's so key here, which is probably something different than maybe fleet owners and operators were thinking 10 years ago, right? If you're thinking about what's my vehicle strategy, the first person you think of is not your electric utility, but we really need to be having those conversations with each other as soon as possible, because there are decisions that the customer might make around, where they locate. And we could, especially a customer that has multiple locations within a service area of one utility, if we could have a coordination conversation, we could say, well, here we could do it in this time frame. Over here, we could do it in that time frame. You know, what are the trade-offs of really making sure that we're having that kind of design conversation very early. So what we've been doing at SCE is trying to initiate those conversations, reaching out to our large customers, monitoring all the announcements people are making about their own commitments and greening their fleet, or where Amazon or others are selling trucks. And those things, I think, can all be factors as we're trying to design a path to this future that is as fast as possible. So I think that's one thing. Another thing that we see is, similar to the challenge that Don mentioned around leasing and owning. We're seeing that kind of across the whole spectrum of vehicle electrification. We know that property owners want to install EV, but it can be kind of a chicken and egg, right? Because you have a limited amount of space. You're going to have to dedicate space for that EV infrastructure, but you might not yet have the demand for it. So we're really working directly with customers to try to make sure they're aware of what are the different values in infrastructure cost recovery that we provide. We will build on the grid side, and we also have programs where we'll build on the customer side. We will help with that cost. There are rebates that the utility, including us, have for chargers themselves. We even have an advisory services group where we can work directly with customers, property managers, fleet owners, and operators, and we can help with the permitting process. But I think the real takeaway is, like, this is no longer kind of a decision that any one of us can make in a silo. I can't just say, here's how I'm going to put the infrastructure out there, and the customer's going to say, here's how I'm going to electrify the fleet. We got to be having these conversations together as soon as possible.
Thank you, Jill. And I had a more specific question for you, Keith, but I'm interested. I'm sure that this discussion for Don and Jill is resonating in some ways. Do you have any reflections on these issues? I'm sure you've confronted these issues, managing grid impacts and as you build out your fleets.
Yeah, well, on this panel, you have the utility represented, you have the manufacturer represented, and in my case, you have the operator represented. And that's what's going to happen for this to move forward. So in our case, it's Con Ed, but we have had a really great partnership as a we're still just a town fleet, a little large, but a town fleet. We've had a great hand-in-hand partnership with Con Ed. We just finished our first 100 fast chargers. We're about to launch our next 275 fast chargers. We go out to every site with Con Ed. We do the load letters. We inspect the sites. They advise us on what we can do, how much it'll cost, where we should kind of abandon our hopes and say, that place is going to be too much for you. And that's been a great partnership, and that's how we're moving this forward on time and on budget. In 2 years ago, we had 0 fast chargers. Now we have 100 with 275 more in the mix. Now, of course, on the truck side, we can't do electrification unless there are trucks in the marketplace to buy and operate, and that can get through. We have a tough environment, right? So we have an electric garbage truck. It's doing well. We plow with electric garbage trucks. So that's a challenge that maybe not too many customers are going to call about, but we need an electric garbage truck that not just can collect waste 340 days a year, but can plow the rest of the year. Same with fire equipment, same with vans, same with pickups, same with all these trucking applications. So we're working closely with manufacturers across the board. I mean, it has been positive though, right? We've seen an incredible move toward electric options. Think about just 15 years ago, right? They did a whole documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car, right? Nobody was talking about the booming electric industry just a little while ago. Now we're seeing light duty. Obviously, we're a very mature electric market. We get more bidders on light duty electric vehicles than we do anywhere else now, right? We're starting to see hit medium, right? The vans and pickups are slowly starting to come into the marketplace. We operate 7,500 of them, so we're very excited about that. And then the trucking, there's no question, 60% of our fuel use is diesel. That is where the emissions are. We've got our first electric garbage trucks out there, the world's first electric sweeper. And for a fun fact, I think 50% of the sweepers in the United States are operated here in New York City. We've electrified and we have hybrid plug-in ambulances. In fact, we announced last week that we put in our last order, and all of New York City's 600 ambulances, as soon as these orders arrive, will actually be hybrid electric. So we're trying, and of course, we have our first 2 school buses that are all electric that were in operation now testing, and only 10,700 more of those to go. But we're starting. But we really do need to see the market continue, more options, more robust options, especially on the trucking side. Light duty is very mature. Trucking is really where we need to see those moves. And Dawn promises she's going to take care of all that.
Indeed, I'm sure. So let's see. So many interesting directions to go in. I think we're hearing a bit about the market and hearing about from the implementation side. I would love to hear a little more on the policy side. Congress, as I'm sure you know, is actively debating 2 major pieces of legislation that could help spur further electric vehicle electrification, including medium duty, heavy duty vehicle incentives and programs. So I would love to hear from you what you think the most important thing or things the federal government could do right now to help with this transition to zero carbon transportation. And, if you also feel free to weigh in on what state and local policymakers should be focused on as well. And I think these pieces need to go together. There is no single federal or state policy. It all fits together from our perspective. So would love to hear your reflections on this moment, and as Congress is having this debate, but also looking down the road and probably the environments you work in all the time, the state and local policy landscape as well. How do these pieces fit together for you? Who would like to go first? I'll put it open.
Well, I'm happy to give it a start. So I think really across the board, whether you're looking at federal or state level, but probably the most important thing right now is to really have some funding to help with purchase incentives and incentives to help with the cost of the infrastructure investments. This technology is here and it's coming, but in these early days, it's very expensive. Depending on what type of vehicle you're talking about, you're looking at least, so I'm speaking in terms of Class 8 trucks, they're 2 to 3 times what the diesel equivalent is. And that is really prohibitive for many fleets to be able to adopt. And so having some public funding available to help pay down the costs of that vehicle is extremely it's needed for the fleets if they're going to maintain their current operations. I mean, they don't have the budgets to take this on. And so at the federal level, there are policies that are being looked at to include in the current bills that are reconciliation and transportation bills and things going through Congress, and also so that this funding is for both vehicles and for the charging infrastructure. And in terms of from a state perspective in particular, I think the public funding is really key at both levels. I think at the state level in particular, I would say something additional that can be done is really to ensure that your government agencies are working together, because you really need to make sure that this whole process of adopting and taking on these this new type of truck or vehicle is as easy as possible for the fleets. I mean, they have a business to run. If they have to say apply to one agency to get funding for the vehicles, and then apply to a whole separate agency to get funding to help with the infrastructure, and then have to deal with so many different stakeholders that they're not used to doing. I mean, they've got a day job trying to do. And so to make it as easy as possible by getting your state agencies to all agree to kind of work together, try and bundle their incentive dollars together, that's extremely helpful. Another thing that can be done on a state level is policies that can help bring down the total cost of ownership for these vehicles. Things like in California, they have the low carbon fuel standard that helps fleets monetize the benefits so that it takes down the cost for them. The one thing I would say is not in and of itself necessarily a good step forward is, and there's been a lot of talk about states adopting California's advanced clean truck regulation. And there's some real concern about states moving forward to adopt that regulation without having all the additional programs and policies and funds available that the state of California has to go along with that. I mean, California's instituted this regulation, but they've also put in literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to help pay for this. They have the low carbon fuel standard. They have they're looking at building the interaction between their agencies. For other states to just adopt the regulation, which was actually based on California's fleet mix, not any other states. That differs from state to state. But to adopt those goals without having the supportive policies in place is really a recipe for failure, I think. And so that's a real important point I want to make for other states as they're looking to try and accelerate. The most important thing you can do, like the Midwest governors announced recently, the Rev Midwest, where they've committed to actually put and work together on cooperation around a regional charging infrastructure. That's a great model for what states can and should be doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawn. Keith or Jill, would you like to go next on the
I was
policy?
just going to build or maybe respond a little bit to what Dawn was saying. So I think a place for the federal government to start is to copy in some ways, maybe not line for line, the way that Dawn pointed out. We do need to have some differences state by state, but there are a lot of states out there and local municipalities that are real leaders in electric transportation. California is one of them. New York, as Keith has pointed out, is another, the Midwest states. And so I don't think the federal government needs to start with any kind of blank page, but let's look at what the states and what the leadership is, where we've already made a lot of inroads. In California, there's an executive order that's not going to allow the sale of internal combustion engines on light duty cars after 2035. There are things like that I think could be adopted nationwide to really help make sure that we're providing the certainty for demand that manufacturers need in order to accelerate their research and development and production of these new technologies. I think then there are some, maybe they sound small tactical things, but they can really make the difference for individual customers, like lifting the cap that we have on tax credits, making sure that there's used EV incentives out there. Right now, SCE does that. We supplement what's available. In fact, we use those clean fuel standards, that revenue that Dawn mentioned, to help pay for that. And we can establish a new tax credit for medium and heavy duty at a federal level that doesn't exist today. So I think that there's a lot we can build on all the work that states and other local jurisdictions have really been leading the way here for years.
Thank you, Jill. Keith, did you want to say anything about, what cities across the country could do to support this transition and to clean zero carbon transportation, or reflect on the federal policy?
Sure. In fact, I do this with my kids. So I'm going to do all three branches of government, and I'm going to do it under a minute. Local, the mayor set a policy that said an executive order, we're going to an all electric fleet. Last week, the city council passed legislation that we're going to an all electric school bus fleet by 2035. Dawn mentioned it, so I'll mention it again. I'm trying to implement electrification and renewable fuels. We always hear that all the renewable diesel in America is sold in California because they have that low carbon fuel standard. There is an effort to take a look at whether New York should have a low carbon fuel standard. We offered a case study on that. We're very interested. And then on the federal side, I just want to offer something that might be unique to us. Under local law in New York City that's been in place since 2003, we are required, the New York City fleet is actually required to publish our CAFE standard equivalent. Just for the New York City fleet, we do buy a lot of vehicles. We have to take the CAFE standards, the EPA CAFE standards, and publish the fuel economy that the city achieves on its new light-duty vehicles. So for the last 4 years, we have published and achieved over 100 miles per gallon on average CAFE equivalent fuel economy for our little town fleet over here. And we do not buy specially government designed vehicles. We buy from companies like Ford and Toyota and GM and Chrysler and all these other companies everyone else can buy from. We just happen to buy the fuel efficient models they sell. Everyone can buy the fuel efficient models they sell. And, I'm not trying to make any commentary about this idea that you can't increase the CAFE standards and the fuel economy standards, but we're proof that you can.
Great. Thank you. Wow. Those are great points to make. let's see. Another thing I would love to hear from you about is perhaps knowledge gaps. I think you've touched on, addressing some of the, hopefully helping the audience better understand some of the challenges to electrifying medium and heavy duty vehicles. But what do you see as some of the key knowledge gaps that have kind of manifested themselves and sort of technical, financial, or regulatory barriers that stakeholders and should be but more aware of? Anybody want to take on that one?
Yeah, let me start because I think there's one that's really fundamental that we could all help, and maybe people listening and participating in this conference could help is I think that we start to approach what are the solutions for an electric transportation future, assuming it needs to look exactly like the one we have right now that's fossil fuel powered. So people say electric vehicles are going to take off when I can fill up my battery as fast as I can fill up my gas tank. And I think that what we should instead be thinking about is that the experience, the fueling experience, the driving experience, the ownership experience, all of that can be and probably should be different in a clean and electric future versus the fossil fuel powered one we have today. So when you're thinking about, like the buses that Keith was talking about, what is about the way that a bus, travels throughout the day, about its pattern of usage, daytime versus nighttime, and what does electric fueling look like for buses, rather than saying it needs to be as simple and easy as my current experience. And as I drive electric vehicles myself, and I fuel them totally differently than I used to fuel a gas powered car. Now I fuel maybe when it's 50% full. I never would have gone to a gas station at 50%. I plug it in at home, or I might plug it in at the store, even if I know I'm only going to get 20 minutes of charge. Like, you completely change your mentality around it. And I think we need to help people who aren't yet adopters also appreciate that it's going to be a different experience. So the solution doesn't have to look the same. We don't need fast EV chargers on every corner replacing the current gas chargers, gas tanks. So.
Thanks, Jill. Great examples. Keith or Don, do you want to jump in on helping get past some of these knowledge gaps?
Well, one thing I'll just say is, in terms of consumer adoption, that electric cars are actually great cars. They're fun to drive. They're fast. You should not go past the speeding limit wherever you are. But, we saw the first commercials for electric cars at last year's Super Bowl, right? We saw the President of the United States in an electric truck recently. That matters, right? I think if we've learned anything in this country, we cannot solve big problems divided. So, and electric cars can kind of sell themselves. They are, most people who do not like electric cars have never driven an electric car and have actually no idea how they actually operate. These are fun, powerful vehicles. I think there is nostalgia for the personal car in the United States. I think it's going to be tough to break. I do not think there's nostalgia for the gas station experience. I don't think anyone's out there saying, I just love it when I go over there and pump that fuel. So I think the electric car is a product that is developing, that can sell itself. Some of the top selling vehicles in the world, not top selling electric cars, but top selling vehicles are electric cars. There's a reason for that. So I think part of that, though, needs to be more to kind of explain that, get people exposure to electric cars and understand these are actually really great products.
I love that. Thank you, Keith. Yeah, Don, please.
I just wanted to add one other thing. I think in terms of knowledge gaps, and I think, there's a number of things I could say, but from a generalized perspective, it would be, and I thought about this since Keith was talking specifically about cars, is for people to understand that there is a huge difference between light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles, and that you can't just extrapolate from the light duty side to the heavy duty side. It is just orders of magnitude different. Everything from, the fact that, we all use, although everybody buys different kind of cars, we all basically use them for the same thing, to get from here to there. Whereas vehicles, trucks, and especially when you're talking about, the higher classes, they're used for all different kinds of applications. So they have to be spec'd differently. The fueling needs are so different. You put in some chargers, light duty chargers in a parking garage is very different how those are going to be used, and the amount of power they're going to need for a fleet that is going to have to, try and charge, 20, 50, 100 trucks. So, just orders of magnitude different. And And from a policy perspective, I'll just share also, as you're looking for charging infrastructure and making this more available, one of the common things we often hear is this idea that in order to use public funds, it should be publicly available or publicly accessible, and that makes sense to some degree. But on the light duty side, but on the heavy duty side, the first users of these vehicles are generally going to be fleets that are doing charging at their own depot or their own location, and it's not realistic to think to make those publicly available. The first chargers aren't going to be public truck charging stations, and so that's a new way of thinking for policymakers when they're trying to put in this funding and these policies to accelerate charging infrastructure, that that usual provision about making something publicly available might not fit in this case. Again, heavy duty is very different than light duty.
Yeah, and well, there are certainly incentives for private investment in wind farms and building building efficiency improvements, and those are private as well. That's a good point. So I think there are some parallels in policy, and I'll just add, I think that's a really interesting point, and I'll just add certainly the public benefits of some of these investments, as I led off this discussion with, are potentially very significant, switching from diesel to a clean fuel. So actually, we have one question in the chat. We have just a couple minutes left, but I wanted to make a point to point out the unique case of sort of Class 8. As you get to heavier duty vehicles, I'm a bit fixated on electrification, I will admit. Are there other, fuels that are perhaps more viable, more likely? What's the viability of, say, fuel cells, or we heard from Keith about biodiesel as well.
Yeah, we absolutely see that there's no one solution going forward, and in our commitment to be all fossil free by 2040 in our products, that includes battery electric, it includes fuel cell electric, it includes some vehicles that are still using internal combustion engines, but that are on renewable fuels that have net zero carbon. And I think that's because there are so many different, as I mentioned before, there are so many different applications where trucks are used that they need to be spec'd differently. And so, battery electric vehicles are going to be excellent in certain applications. Some of the, we've all seen buses are already there and getting there quickly, and delivery vehicles and things, but you really can't take cross-country trips with battery electric vehicles, and to build out that charging infrastructure isn't going to make sense. And so, fuel cells are going to be much better for a long haul application or longer haul application than battery electrics. And part of that will depend as we go forward, and we see how battery technology develops. And so there's still a lot of unknowns, but we have a major investment with partnership with our competitor Daimler Trucks in a new company that's looking at developing the fuel cell vehicles. And so we are definitely pursuing many different options here.
Great, thank you, Dawn. Yeah, that was a great response, and hopefully helpful for the audience to get a sense of the different use cases, different vehicle types. We only have a minute or a minute and a half left. Would you each want to say a word by way of closing? Keith, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Electric vehicles are awesome. Was kind of a nice closer. I'm paraphrasing, but I'll give everyone a few seconds, maybe 10, 20 seconds to close out the discussion.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. And I'm just going to respond to something Dawn said. She's absolutely right. Most of your charging in a fleet application has to be kind of kept the fleet. But we have opened up our first 11 fast chargers out of DCAS for public access. So come to New York, bring an electric car, and we'll power you up.
That's great. I will add that, we've got big goals and we've got a lot of work to do. And there's really something like 2030 is not very far away. At Edison, we just issued a paper we call Mind the Gap, where we're comparing where we are, where we need to be. And we need to keep our feet on the accelerator of all of this transformation for us to achieve these really critical climate goals.
And I'll just add my thanks for being included here, and to just really echo something Jill said earlier, is it's really important to have good communication between all the different stakeholders. That is really, really critical all around to work together, because this is a whole new paradigm.
Well, thanks to all three of you. It was an honor and pleasure to moderate this panel, and really appreciated the conversation. Looks like Jennifer is back. Back to you.
Thank you, James. James, Jill, Don, and Keith, thanks so much for joining us. And I'll look forward to part 2 of this conversation. I can tell you there was a lot of head nodding in the backstage area over here. Just want to thank all of you in the audience. Again, thanks for joining us today and kicking off our 2021 Climate Leadership Series. We have an exciting program for you tomorrow, beginning with a special roundtable discussion among executive leadership from 5 of the nation's most significant power companies, sharing what opportunities lie ahead and why they are up for the challenge of decarbonizing the U.S. power sector. And following that conversation, we invite you to join and also celebrate our 2021 Climate Leadership Award winners, who will join us through a series of live interviews and pre-recorded video to share details of their inspiring journeys. We'll see you back here tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Thanks all.